Hello, everyone. Hope everyone's staying safe, staying healthy. I just want to give you a heads up. Today is the last lecture. I know, sad face. This is my favorite lecture, so I hope that you enjoy it as well. It's one that I'm going to try my damnedest to keep under 50 minutes, but there's just a lot of exciting things to talk about. So this is Chapter 20, Part 2, moving into contemporary art, which for us we're defining after 1945. So remember, there's a distinction between modern art, that is art about modernity, which is generally about 1880 to 1945-ish. For the sake of our lectures and for our class, we said 1900 to 1945. And then contemporary art we define as artists that are living, art made by contemporary artists. And so it's art about contemporary times, which is different than art about modern times. So first we're going to start about abstract expressionism, which is in the tail end of modern art. It actually starts at the beginning of World War II and then really gets into full swing after World War II. So this is an art movement that's really defined by a uniqueness, that is artwork that is really open and free, work that is non-referential. It doesn't necessarily point to the outside world. It's not trying to be realistic or naturalistic. It's meant to be very, very much abstract. It's also called abstract expressionism because the artist worked very in gestural motions and they wanted work to be large, and the work itself was supposed to be expressive of moods, emotions, feelings, that sort of thing, as opposed to necessarily real people or portraits, still lifes, historical kind of genres that we typically think about with conventions of art. Probably one of the most famous groups is called the New York School, and this is a group of painters that loosely were affiliated with one another. Some of them were self-taught, some of them came out of the Depression and worked as mural painters first. For instance, Jackson Pollock, probably one of the best known New York School artists, actually worked with the artist Thomas Hart Benton, who was doing a lot of regional murals for the Works Progress Administration. So some of you were in my Year 1 murals class. Shout out to Abby and Tatum. And you remember we went and saw a WPA mural that was in Heber Springs. That was artists that were unemployed, that were paid to make work because they were out of jobs or out of commission. And so this New York School was sort of this kind of rough and tumble group. They were known to be very kind of hip and in vogue. And it really made United States like the center of the art world for the first time, really. So the New York City became the art capital of sort of the art world during this time in like the 1940s, mid-1940s, early 1950s. And actually surpasses Paris and London as being an art capital. De Kooning, which we talked about before, he is this Dutch artist that moves to the United States. Remember, early in the semester we talked about his painting, North Atlantic Light, and his move towards abstraction to capture the idea of the landscape without actually having to paint the landscape. And he started with work that you could call figurative, like this one, for instance. And at first it looks purely abstract, non-referential. But then when you look at the title, it says Woman and Bicycle. Then you want to look a little bit closer and figure out where you can see, say, the face, the eyes, the chest here, a bicycle here perhaps with the wheel. And it then starts to emerge as this sort of new reality. Another really famous artist in the New York School is Mark Rothko. Mark Rothko was born in what was Russia at the time. He was born in Dvinsk, Russia, which is now Daugavpils, Latvia. Some of you might remember that last fall I did an artist residency at the Mark Rothko Art Center. This is the city where he was born. So Mark Rothko moved to the United States at a very young age. He's about 9 years old. Moved to the West Coast first. He lived in the Pacific Northwest. Didn't speak English. Quickly learned. He spoke many other languages, though quickly learned, started school late even, and then graduated high school early, which is really amazing. Then he moved to the East Coast He studied at Yale to be a lawyer, actually left school, was kind of jaded. He was Jewish, and there was a lot of anti-Semitism after World War II. And he moves later to New York City and gets really close with some artists like Max Weber and Milton Avery, who were American modernists in the tradition of George O'Keeffe, who we looked at last time, and Edward Hopper. He becomes friends with them. He starts teaching young children at a Jewish school, and he continues to do this even after he becomes a really famous, well-known artist. I believe Becca went and saw the play Red when she went to a festival, which is a really cool modern play that is about the artist Mark Rothko's life. He's one of my favorites. His work was known as color field, which I showed you earlier in the semester. It's abstract expressionism, but it's meant to be immersive. And when you look at these canvases, and they're large, you're dwarfed by them. There's a beautiful one at Crystal Bridges that I hope you all get the opportunity to go see. When you're looking at these, Mark Rothko was trying to make these almost like a spiritual connection, similar to Kandinsky, thinking about his art, which is interesting because he's also from this Russia era. And ideally, what Rothko wanted you to do was to get about 18 inches, about this far away from his painting, and just be immersed in it and just stand there in the glow of the painting. So this is one of the paintings that is in the book, Mark Rothko, Four Darks in Red. A lot of his paintings were untitled. A lot of times museums or owners gave the paintings titles about, what the particular relationship was between the color. But he stuck for over 20 years. He stuck with a really similar format, and that is these bars or these blocks of color of squares or horizontal fields within the larger vertical horizontal rectangle as well. These look really simplistic, but the more you look, which is something that I always urge you to do as art patrons, as people that appreciate the arts, it's just like move in close and look at what you see developing and emerging. So at first you might just see reds and oranges and browns and blacks, but when you get up close you might notice there's lots of layering happening, blues, greens, yellows, and these are just the top layers that hit you at first. And what's interesting about the work is it really starts to, everything kind of dissolves out and you're really entering into this. So for me, it's a lot about the sublime as well. I see it as romanticism because you can almost see that still there's that horizon line of what's sky and land or water beneath it. And it's more of how we respond. It's similar to Van Gogh, how we respond to the landscape, or in this case, just pure emotion and color. And if you think about art therapy at all, or color therapy, we know that color can be rejuvenating. It can have a therapeutic effect. It can affect your mood. Am I right? I mean, you can enter into a place, you can wear a certain shirt, you can go into a room and it's painted like drab colors and it feels depressing, or maybe it's bright colors that just really resonate with you and can put you in a good mood. So for me, a great Mark Rothko painting can really do that. I just want to highlight just for a second my opportunity to go do that artist residency. I was one of 10 artists globally selected to go to the Mark Rothko Art Center, this beautiful, amazing old arsenal that's in this Dog of Poles fortress. So it's this larger complex. It was built during the Napoleonic era, and it was meant to be sort of a military fortress to defend against the troops coming in. But it quickly became obsolete. Later it was a military base, and then it was abandoned for quite some time when the Soviet era collapsed and Latvia regained its independence. So this building they redid about 10 years, and Mark Rothko has passed away, actually died by suicide in the early 70s. He had a stomach condition, cancer, that was overtaking his health, and doctor told him he wouldn't be able to paint anymore. So a lot of people believe he took his own life rather than facing this painful future without art in his life anymore. So his two descendants, his two kids, started with their art collection, started this amazing museum, and it's a really, really special place to me in Latvia. So I had the opportunity to stay in this room right here, and then this was my studio here. It was an awesome opportunity. I was there for a few weeks in the fall, And the work that I made there, I got donated to the Mark Rothko Art Center and now remains part of their permanent collection, which was a really special opportunity. So here you can see my studio that I had while I was there, and then the room that I stayed in. It's just beautiful. And this is one of the paintings that I created called Facades, based on this quote that when I was researching Mark Rothko, who's always been one of my biggest art influences. He said that he likes to open up a window to the world, or a door to the world, but only one or two slowly at a time, as opposed to revealing all. He said in that way his paintings were like facades. So I was really influenced by the colors. Like typically I don't use a lot of yellow, but there was just so much yellow around in the landscape, and just I could talk to you for hours about my experience there, but just was really impactful for me. And obviously for me it was like, hey, once in a lifetime opportunity and a career highlight for me. So Mark Rothko holds a special place near and dear to me. Another really famous and influential artist is Jackson Pollock. He was, in the 1940s, really a forerunner for abstract expressionism. A lot of the abstract expressionist artists hated that title. They felt like what they were all trying to do was very unique and not necessarily should be lumped together in this group art movement. But there were some simplistic combinations and conventions that they were using, sort of a similar vocabulary, if you will, that they were using. So he nicknamed his painting action painting or gesture painting, and he would paint on the floor as opposed to on an easel or the wall, and he would drip and pour paint directly on. Now, a lot of people look at Jackson Pollock's work and say, there's not much to it, and I can do that, right? Or I could do that, or a kid could do that. Yes, you could, but you didn't. Right? Jackson Pollock was the first to do it. In that way, it was avant-garde, it was influential, and trust me, there's no other Jackson Pollock. You can try to do this, and I've tried to do this, and other artists have tried to do this. It doesn't look like a Jackson Pollock. They're really intricate. They have this great rhythm and balance and harmony to them. He doesn't just merely pour the paint on. There is a rhyme and a reason to it, and if you look at the layering, for instance, if you just start to look at one color like black, and then notice where it repeats throughout the composition, or we could do the same thing for white, or yellow, or pink, and it doesn't, not one area seems underdone or overdone, right? That there's this nice level of balance to it. So again, Jackson Pollock, and one of the true, he was born in Wyoming, lived in New York City, so one of the true American artists, because I saw this meme the other day, it was funny, it showed the guy from SpongeBob, and he had lined up all of these burgers, and he was like flexing and saying, like, someone put on the meme, Giotto, Michelangelo, Raphael, these are all the artists Italy contributed, and then it shows the United States as like SpongeBob eating one little puny hamburger and says, America contributes Thomas Kincaid, right? Well, we truly have Jackson Pollock, we have George O'Keeffe as artists, Andy Warhol. These are like true American, like significant names that, do they compete with Michelangelo, Raphael? That's debatable, right? But at least they're household names, and their works command a lot of value in society, but also financial market as well. So the next art movement is pop art. A lot of people's favorite. You probably know the name Andy Warhol, also Claes Oldenburg, Roy Lichtenstein, Jim Dine, just to name a few, Jasper Johns. They were doing things in response in the 1960s, in response to abstract expressionism. They felt like, okay, everybody's been there, done that, seen this. There's nothing to latch onto. Let's do something that's perhaps more authentic, has more authenticity than abstract expressionism and this sort of like gesture of like anything goes. So it was really a way to reflect what was going on in society. Andy Warhol and Jasper Johns were two, and Robert Rauschenberg were three of the most early practitioners of pop art in the United States. So this is in London and in New York, this really unique art movement that's about commercial society and the market and popular goods, hence pop art, right? So Andy Warhol famously interpreted things like Marilyn Monroe, Coca-Cola, Campbell Soup. Interestingly enough, when he started to do the Campbell Soup, Campbell at the time was just a regional soup company. They weren't incredibly famous. They weren't like they didn't have the market cornered. They were probably like, just a small business. They were going to sue Andy Warhol. Then they said, actually issued a letter, a cease and desist. They were going to threaten legal action. Then his work just blew up, and Campbell's, in the process, became a household name and the most famous soup company in the United States. So it's kind of like artists helping the product, similar to what Run DMC did to Adidas that was struggling back in the day in the 1980s until they started wearing their shoes, write a song about it, or Air Jordan for Nike did the same thing. Roy Lichtenstein took literally comic book strips or comic panels that were on the scale of a newspaper or a comic book and made them huge. So he was trained as a billboard painter and had done some of that work, commercial art, and then he wanted to make commercial art into fine art. So Andy Warhol, did he do anything new? Well, no, he was using a lot of pre-existing imagery. So in a way, it's kind of like this Duchampian gesture. But instead of it referencing back to things that maybe don't have a clear meaning, it's a mirror, holding up a mirror to society and commercial goods and greed in the United States, those types of things. Roy Lichtenstein, another piece. These are called Ben-Day dots here that you can see. Some of these artists started to use something called mechanical reproduction, like Warhol used silkscreen, which we talked about in the printmaking chapter. And Lichtenstein hand-painted these teeny tiny little Ben-Day dots that you can see in the face that would have been common for graphic artists or newspapers to use to reproduce something and make it look like value. Like if you look up close, those are red dots. But when you squint from a distance, it looks like an even flesh tone. Minimalism is the next art movement. It emerges in the 1970s. This is an artwork that is similar to Marcel Duchamp, where you could take simply an object or atypical materials and lay them out. Remember we talked about process art when we did the Kill a Sharpie. We talked about artists like Sol LeWitt. Process art is where you think about the conceptual aspect, the repetition of the gesture as opposed to the composition itself. It more adds up to this cumulative effort of individual little actions. This becomes minimalism, really popular in the 70s. A response is basically like a distillation, I believe, of things that happened in abstract expressionism. But in a way, it's kind of removing the artist's hand. Because remember when we talked about Sol LeWitt, we talked about how other artists would actually create these pieces for him. He would give the plans, the museum would own the plans, and then they would have people come make the drawings. So in this case, it's a painting, and it's this repetition of marks. Sol LeWitt had many different types of works, and some of these only existed for a brief period, maybe the year that they were exhibited, and others become permanent installations in the museums or the galleries that purchase the piece. Another example of minimalism is the artist Donald Judd. There is an interesting, I think it's on Netflix, if I'm not mistaken. It's a really good series with Kristen Hahn in it, and it's called I Love Dick, and it's loosely based on the life of Donald Judd. If anyone has been to Marfa, Texas, or is from Texas, you might be aware of Marfa, Texas. It's kind of like in the middle of nowhere, but it has this really rich artist community. That's where Donald Judd was. He chose to live there after he was working in New York City, and he established this essentially like a foundation where artists could show their work, and a lot of his works are exhibited. So he no longer is living, but this foundation continues to exist, and you can go and tour it. Marfa, Texas, look it up, check it out. And his work is just really these beautiful, simple boxes, forms, individual little modules or units that he would repeat and then put them on a wall. And so they were wall sculptures or floor sculptures, and it just shifts our expectation of what art is and what it can be and how we as a viewer respond to those works. And again, it's almost like a mechanical thing. It seems similar to a little bit like pop art. It really removes the artist's hand from the work, like Warhol did with the screen prints, or this idea of just copying something that already exists. This looks like it would be more used in the industrial setting than it would be in the art setting. But really interesting work, and it can create its own sort of repetition and harmony as well. Ava Hess is not in the book, but I really like her work, and I wanted to share an example of a female artist that's working in this vein of minimalism. Her work was all about process art. She was really influential for a lot of contemporary artists. She started as a painter, went to Yale, but then started to work in this tradition of making objects. She used a lot of resins and materials that she could pour. Unfortunately, a lot of those materials were caustic, and at the time she wasn't very careful. She didn't use, they were like industrial resins and molds and materials that she was using, plastics that people generally didn't use in an art studio, and she didn't use good ventilation or wear a respirator at all. So she unfortunately died at a really, really young age from a brain tumor that was likely caused from working from these dangerous materials. So her work in a way is about this beauty and the simplicity of everyday objects, but can also kind of be seen as this new way of making art and thinking about art as well. So each of these is about this big. She has a whole just range of artwork. This is just the tip of the iceberg. The next movement that we see emerging at the same time as minimalism is feminist art. And similar to abstract expressionism in a sense that there's not just one way of making or talking about feminist art. There was many different artists, as many different styles and movements as there were female artists that were working within this movement. So it comes out of the feminist art, the feminist movement in general, sort of political or social activism, very kind of DIY. In a way, it comes out of this sense of protest. And also, some of these artists, especially the Guerrilla Girls, worked with raising awareness about the inequality between the sexes in the art world. And in that time, it was women were really shut out of a lot of the museums, and still are, honestly. So this is work that still needs to be talked about and discussed. For instance, me personally, if I think about, like, say, the art program, 75% of our art majors are female, but yet if you look at the art world, a lot of the people that have shows or that are professors, etc., are men. So there's still this inequality that exists, right? Probably one of the best known practitioners of feminist art is Barbara Kruger. She used appropriated imagery and added text to these images. So a lot of these were found photographs that she got out of archives that were free to use. So like photographs that you might see in Time Life magazine, or like you might see in a book illustrating like a science textbook or that sort of thing. She would enlarge them, make them huge, and she always used these really three consistent elements: a black and white photograph, text, and a red outline. And so black, white, and red was real simplistic, and you can see she adds this text. So we kind of maybe look at this image one way, and if it was in a book, we might think, okay, it relates to this text, whatever this text is about. But now she's changed the context of it. She's changed the meaning, much in the way that hip-hop artists will take a song, sample it, take a little bit of it out of context, and recontextualize it and form and imbue new meaning with that particular song. And try to do something new and different with it. And maybe not even try to touch a song that's really recognizable, try to grab an obscure song. She's doing the same thing, right? So this phrase, "your gaze hits the side of my face." So it's really thinking about what at the time was referred to as the male gaze. If we think about throughout art history, a lot of imagery was having women as the subject of a painting. A lot of times they were nude, and it was kind of meant for male gratification, right? To look at females as an object of desire. We call it the male gaze, which was for the first time being really explored by feminist artists in the 1970s and saying, what we need to change the way that people are looking at art and making art. So Guerrilla Girls was a really interesting art movement in the 70s. They're still active today. You can look up their website, guerrillagirls.com, and they are masked. Their identities are masked, and they've done things in sort of protest and to raise awareness between the inequality of the sexes in art. That in a way that men have had a lot more art opportunities. I mean, if you just for centuries, if you flip through this text, that's why I try to do a good job in highlighting artists of color and women artists as well, because they've been neglected a lot through art history. And so they made these billboards, they did protest signs. This one, for instance, less than 4% of the artists in modern art sections are women, right? So if you think about in modern art sections of museums across the world, 4% of the artists are women. 96% are men, but 76% of the nudes are female. So they're saying like, hey, if you're a woman, the best way to get into the Met is to be naked, right? And so when you remember this image here, it's a photograph, but it's a representation of Ang's Grand Odalisque. So think about like Manet's Olympia, for instance. Like those are a lot of common depictions. And here they put their famous Gorilla Girl mask on there. So we don't know the identity except for one of the Gorilla Girls. The rest of them remain anonymous, but one acts as sort of like this PR ambassador, and the rest of them always wear these masks when they make art. And this isn't meant to be an art piece as well. So not just sort of like propaganda or a billboard, but meant to be art. And they've had art shows. They're still active today and still kind of protesting the gender inequality. This is an artist, Cindy Sherman, also a feminist artist from the 1980s, takes self-portraits. A lot of her work is posed, meant to look like movie film stills. She's also questioned this idea of the male gaze and recreated a lot of famous artworks like pieces by Goya or Raphael, and dressed herself just like you are supposed to do your quarantine challenge for extra credit and recreate a masterwork. She's done that with photographs. This particular one is one from her Untitled film series from 1981, and really interesting work. And if you notice, if you look at a lot of Cindy Sherman, she always has one hand that seems kind of curious. She's clicking the photograph. She has a cord that's connected to her camera, and then she'll click the photograph. So she has to hide that cord and include, that as part of the photograph. The next movement is land art. This is art that's made in the environment and strips art out of the normal context of the gallery, that sort of neutral white cube, and out into the world. We've talked about land art and environmental art a little bit, like Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty. This is also a famous artist couple, Christo and Jean-Claude, who do these wrapped works. They do these site-specific works. In this case, they wrapped islands. They did a famous piece in New York City called Gates as well, about 2000, that wrapped through Central Park with these gates that had these flags on them. They also recently created a walkway to an island in Italy that was about 1/4 of a mile away from the land. So you could walk out on this floating deck all the way to the island. So this is canvas that they wrapped around these individual little islands with pink. What's interesting about them too is a lot of artists will rely on public funding, like grants from the government, to support their work, especially work like this that might cost a couple $1 million to execute. But they do all of their work self-funded. So they sell drawings and prints to fund the work. When they've raised enough money, millions of dollars, then they go execute it, which is pretty cool. But the actual art is the event itself. It's very temporal. It changes with time, and it only exists for a brief moment. And Andy Goldsworthy is another example of this, and this was one of the options that y'all could have watched for your movie review, but I don't think anyone actually did. It's called Rivers and Tides. His work is really, really cool. You don't have to watch it now. Your movie reviews are done. Y'all did a good job on those. But if you're interested, now that you're in isolation and quarantine, check it out. It's a great documentary, Rivers and Tides. It talks about the work of Andy Goldsworthy that he does out in nature by himself, not for an audience. Like this, for instance, he cracked with a rock these bigger rocks apart, and you can see where he chisels them apart and then makes this spiral out of it, which is really similar to Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty that we've already talked about. In the 80s, there was this huge abundance of street art and graffiti. If you think about the graffiti movement in New York City, started in Bronx and Harlem, moves to the rest of New York City, and then throughout the world. Actually started earlier, probably in the 50s and 60s, becomes really popular in the 70s. One of the most famous of these artists is Jean-Michel Basquiat, who started as a street artist, started doing graffiti, and he wrote these phrases. And he signed his name Sam O, which is supposed to be, it stands for two things, like same old shit or same old bullshit, but also the black racist stereotypical character Sambo, S-A-M-B-O. So it's kind of a take on that. He later starts to move into fine art. So he is of French Haitian descent, lives in New York City. And there's a beautiful, I forgot to mention it earlier, there's a great film called Pollock about Jackson Pollock. It stars Ed Harris as Jackson Pollock. Pollock, sorry. You should check that out. It's a really, really good film. It's a movie. And then there's a movie that was made in the mid-90s about Basquiat, starring Jeffrey Wright as Basquiat. He does an amazing job, and it also has David Bowie, rest in peace, starring as Andy Warhol, and he looked just like him, and he was really, really good friends with Basquiat. Andy Warhol was. It talks about some of their collaborations. Definitely, it was made by an artist too that was really popular in the 80s. You should check out the film. It's a really, really good film. Basquiat, look it up. Banksy, also another really famous street artist, started as a graffiti artist, now kind of more known as this humorous image here, Kissing Coppers. He started in London. He's known as Banksy because he was making his works on the banks of the Thames River in London, later starts to do fine art. His identity is still masked and we don't know who he is. A really great documentary about his film that's probably a bit of a hoax or fictitious is called Exit Through the Gift Shop. That's a really good one. You may have seen it. Check it out if you haven't. It talks about his work, and you probably know a lot of his work's about stunts. He did that series of works called Dismal Land, where he recreated Disney but made it all about street art. And then he also did that very, very famous auction where the second someone bought his piece, it shredded. Have you seen that? That was pretty rad. New directions in painting. This is a painter, Elizabeth Murray. Some of you watched the documentary about Elizabeth Murray, a really great painting called Bop. We use it as, you've probably been staring at this all semester, right? Does this look familiar to you? I've used it as the icon, the image for our class for Intro to Visual Arts. And her work is abstract, but the more you look at it, the more you recognize that it's representational. Like here is an outlet. This is part of a fence here. Here's a boot. There's different elements in it. Remember we looked at that one coffee cup before that was split in two earlier in the semester. Here's a door with this exaggerated doorknob. Her work is abstract, but also very comical and cartoony. Gerhard Richter is an artist that started in the 80s. He's a contemporary artist, still living today, one of the highest paid painters. His works command high prices at auctions. What's really interesting about him is there's this duality in his work. Most artists will focus on one body of work their entire career, or maybe they'll focus on just landscapes, or just abstract, or just representational. What's really cool about Gerhard Richter, and not many artists do this, is he splits his practice between abstract paintings and representational paintings. And he's not just good at one of them, he's amazing at both of them. So on the left, a painting where he squeegees on the paints in these overall large gestures. And on the right, this painting that looks a lot like a photograph that's just really meticulous and detailed, that has this slight kind of haze to it. He does a lot of paintings that he just like slightly blurs when he's done. He'll paint it and then just kind of like wipe it a little bit to make it blurry. So really interesting work. And then there are some black artists that are working in the 80s that raise a lot of awareness for issues with people of color and minorities and encouraging sort of diversity in the art world. If you think about the inequality of male versus female artists, there was even much more so inequality for people of color in the 70s and 80s. So a lot of artists, for instance, Kerry James Marshall, who was working in Chicago to try to raise the visibility of the African American struggle and to sort of revive what we talked about with the Harlem Renaissance. Black artists being proud about their history, their traditions, and making work that is speaking to a new generation. He was really interested in showing how blacks in the North became really interested in Democrats as sort of like post-Kennedy, like black tradition in being active in politics and social activism. And this particular painting and many other paintings, if you notice in the background, it's a housing project. And what his idea was that a lot of times it says, "In my house there are many mansions." That's a quote, right, from the Bible. God talking about the fact that, you know, the kingdom of heaven is going to have a lot of people in it. But this interpretation here is saying, look at this housing project, which is sort of like this bleak housing project, kind of a ghetto scene. they're always named like these like idyllic or romantic names. In this case, this one is called Statiny Gardens, and you can see the SG representing that, and people kind of tending to this garden. In a way, it's like this contradiction between beauty and then sterile industrial governmental housing projects. Really interesting work. Kerry James Marshall, still active today. And another black artist is Carol Walker. We call this painting, but really it's paper cut silhouettes. And her work is dealing with art that is about the difficult histories to discuss in the United States, or part of the plantation South, antebellum South, post-Reconstruction, so slavery, right after Civil War, Jim Crow. And she's using the method of storytelling that would have been popular in the time, and that's Victorian silhouettes or cutouts. So these works have a lot of irony, a lot of racist, stereotypical imagery, and just a lot of horrific, really, scenes in it. Like there might be like one element of beauty or romance in it, but then another element of just like tragedy. Really interesting work, a young artist that's making very poignant and relevant work. We looked at her piece that was the domino piece. Remember that? The big sphinx with the face on it that was made of sugar. Shifting into global practices. So this is where artwork becomes a little bit more globalized, and art from all over the place is now being able to get recognized all over the place as well. So you don't just make art for your immediate surroundings. If you think about it, if you were like an impressionist artist in the 1880s, most of the people that saw your work were your peers. Most of the people that saw your work, if you exhibit in a Paris gallery, were those people that went to that Paris gallery. Mostly just French people. And so now we have real global practices. Artists from all over the world are able to share their work uniquely with the rest of the world. There's this art movement in the 90s called Young British Artists, also known as the YBAers, and one of the most famous practitioners is Damien Hirst. He's actually sold the highest priced item at an auction by a living artist. And some people say some of his practices are somewhat unethical because sometimes he invests his own money back into his artwork and buys some of his artwork back as a business partner so that he can exhibit it and get more money from it. This is a piece that he calls The Physical Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Living. So it's a sort of esoteric title, but it's doing something that you would typically probably expect to see in a science museum, or perhaps an aquarium or a natural history museum, as opposed to an art museum. So it's recontextualizing things. And what he did is he took these these preserved animals, a cow, a shark, and preserved them in formaldehyde that they're floating in, and presented them in the gallery context. He became very famous for this. He also did this piece, which was the highest selling piece by a contemporary artist of all time. And it's called For the Love of God. Story goes that his mom, after he was making these, said, "For the love of God, Damien, what are you going to make next?" And he gets this idea to encrust a human skull with over 8,000 diamonds. Holy shit. Like, the value of this thing is like, just the diamonds in themselves cost like $250,000 just in how many diamonds he had to put. I mean, some of these are massive diamonds too. And it's about like objects as being like significant in anthropology. Like if you dug this up, it's like, what does it say about the society that's living in it? Like people making crystal skulls. Well, here it is a contemporary artist saying, this is what we have to say and reflect on our society. That's about diamonds. It's about this idea of like showing your love in this sort of artificial way. And this piece sold for a lot by a business conglomerate. We talked about Sai Guo Cheng's work before. He's the artist that had Skyladder. Some of you watched that as your first documentary. And he's the artist that does a lot with fireworks, which if you think about as a Chinese artist, this makes sense because the history of fireworks starting in China, and then also his work as a landscape artist. His father was a landscape artist, and the tradition of ink paintings in China as well. So this was one of his early paintings before he started doing the large firework displays like we studied. Remember the 27 footprints of history from the Beijing Olympics. And this is one of his drawings here. This is one of my favorite artists. This is a contemporary artist. Ai Weiwei, and he took these vases that were from the Huang dynasty that were very expensive vases, and he said, this is what's representative of our culture. And he did this performance piece where he dropped them and he destroyed them. In a way, he's saying, like, we can't revere our old traditions. He's a very famous Chinese dissident. If there's these bad practices happening, in a way, this is what we're doing to our collective heritage. We're destroying it. And so he's been arrested many times. One of the pieces that he got arrested for, he made this piece that was about critical of the Chinese government when there was this earthquake in China. He made a piece that that preserved all the backpacks of children that were killed when this school collapsed during an earthquake. And the Chinese government tried to cover it up, and they lied about how many people had actually died. They weren't forthcoming about the inadequacies of the building, that it wasn't up to code, and they tried to sugarcoat how many people actually died. He was in prison for this and many other works that he's done, and he's been very, very critical to the Chinese government. So he's an interesting artist. This is one of his pieces that he made as well. I love it because it's really similar to some of the things that we see in pop art, like Andy Warhol, but it's uniquely taking his culture and adding a new kind of twist on it. And you think about like the commercialization, how China is a communist country, but still allows aspects of capitalism to enter into their general kind of daily activities as well. So it's kind of like the old versus the new. Maurizio Cattelan. You knew I was going to talk about this at some point. You know this piece, right? Everybody was talking about this. Art Basel, this was the star of the show earlier this year. Maurizio Cattelan did this piece where he inserted a banana on the gallery wall and duct taped it, right? And everyone's like, what the literal F? Like, that's too easy. How can an artist sell this for $150,000 when it's just a banana duct taped to the wall? Well, this isn't necessarily his best piece, but I guarantee you a lot more people were talking about Maurizio Cattelan, am I right, after this happened than before. But he's really, and this piece was called Comedian, because he was in a way, he's a bit of a huckster, he's a bit of a comedian. He tries to do things that are like pranks. His work is really interesting. Some of you watched his documentary, I'll Be Right Back by Maurizio Cattelan. I believe it was Emma that characterized it best by saying his work is meant to be controversial on purpose, and that's what drew her to checking out his work. Maurizio, though, had this piece in the Venice Biennale in Italy, of all places, and it's showing the Pope getting struck, the Pope at the time getting struck by a meteoroid that had come through the ceiling. What? Just bizarre. And he's doing this in Italy. It's just insane to think about. And he doesn't make a lot of his work. This is called The Ninth Hour. A lot of his work is made by craftspeople and artisans in the kind of the commercial field, and he makes it into art. So is this art? I don't know. Does this fit your definition of art? Maybe, maybe not. But we're definitely talking about it. So it makes art something that is connecting us, something that we can relate to, that we can have a conversation about. It's art. I think it's art. Is it good art? Probably not. But it does something to raise awareness about Maurizio Cattelan's other work. And just like Banksy, it really questions why we're looking at art. And if you know about Art Basel, it's this big event in Miami where tons of people go and see the hippest, newest art. And it becomes a real spectacle. And he's a comedian because he's really poking fun at that. And hell, if you can duct tape a banana to a wall and sell it for $150,000, kudos. Well done. Like, no one's ever going to question like the Jonas Brothers. Okay, I don't like their music. No one's going to say, should they have made $3 million on a song that kind of sucks when they whistle? Like, no one's going to question that, right? So why should we question Maurizio Cattelan putting a banana? You know, and it kind of quotes Andy Warhol too, who did the Velvet Underground cover, which is a beautiful cover called Peel Slowly and See, and you could actually peel off the sticker and there was a real banana behind it. So kudos, right? One of the last artists that I want to show you is Olafur Eliasson, and this is just kind of moving into using the museum as art in and of itself. And he did this project called the Weather Project, where he installed this fake sun that actually created an effect of light and warmth. It became one of the most popular exhibitions at the Tate ever. And people started to gather and do things like do their yoga there. People would lay there all day and just kind of be bathed in the sun. He does really interesting phenomenon type works. Like I went to this one exhibition that Olafur Eliasson had that it was mist, and you walked in his gallery, it was all black, and there was mist coming from the ceiling, and it looks like, well, shit, I'm not going to walk through that because I'll get all wet. But the mist was dispersed so slowly by the time you walked through it, it didn't actually get you wet. It just looked like mist, and it wasn't actually physically hitting you like water. Really interesting stuff, and he plays on color theories and principles. He's sort of like turning impressionist paintings into real environments or installations. I want to show you two videos, and these are examples. Remember we talked about Marina Abramovic, who did the performance art. These are contemporary examples of performance art. The first is by an Icelandic artist named Ragnar Kjartansson. And he started as a musician first. He was in a band called The Funerals. And this is this installation that he does that's been exhibited a few places. This is when it was at San Francisco. It's also in New York. I saw it in Houston, and it was beautiful. It's 9 separate screens and these different musicians that are all being filmed at the same time playing the same song, but in different spots of this old mansion. And this is Ragnar himself here playing naked in the bathtub. And if you watch all the way to the end, you see him get up and see his little winky as he gets out of the bathtub. It's a really amazing video. When I saw it, I was transfixed. I could not move. I thought, shit, I'll watch this for 15 or 20 minutes because I really like his work. I stayed for the entire hour performance. And actually, if you ask my son, Aiden, or if you ask my wife, Carly, I habitually watch this thing like at least once a week on YouTube. I'm a big fan. I love Ragnar's work. I've seen another one of his pieces in New York that was called Death is Elsewhere. It's also a really cool piece to check out. And I think I showed that to you earlier in the semester, where 2 sets of twins are walking around a panoramic view, and it really hits you in a really beautiful way. I'll watch this for a few minutes, and I'll shut up.
Pink rose in the glittery frost, diamond heart and the orange red fire. Once again, I fall into my favorite way. Once again, I fall into my favorite way. You protect the world from me. I think I'm the only one who's clean. You take up me.
Beautiful video. I love it. I'll share this on Schoology, and I encourage all of you to watch it in its entirety. It's just shy of an hour. The last artist that I want to show you is a contemporary artist from Argentina. His name is Leandro Ehrlich, and he does work that is all about illusions. He wants to be an artist that's sort of like a conceptual magician. One of his pieces that he did in London was a celebration of the neighborhood. And what he did was he made a huge mirror where a building should be, and then he built the facade of a building on the ground so that people could climb on the floor, and then their reflection would be shown on that beautiful mirror, and it would look like they're scaling the wall or falling off of it. It was an amazing piece. And this is a piece that he did called Swimming Pool. It was in New York in 2008, and it's now permanently installed in a museum in Japan. And I just wanted to show you this and leave off on contemporary art, showing you that really anything is possible in art. And I truly mean that to be an inspiration. I don't want you to be intimidated by art and think that you have to understand it all, but that you can appreciate it. So this particular piece, it looks as if people are underwater. You can walk into a gallery down below, or you can see the same pool from up above in the gallery above. And it's really just this glass plane that he's left a little bit of water on top of, and you can see down in it. And he's created this illusion of people walking freely underwater without having to drown or hold their breath or anything. So it's an amazing piece, really interesting, defies our expectations of what art can be, and it's really, this guy's swimming, I love it. Check it out, it's fresh. And you know, changing, we have to really, let our expectations go, and it's a suspension of disbelief. And it really makes you interact with the work much differently than a static painting or a photograph or a print or a sculpture. Even though sculpture is three-dimensional, you can walk around it. This is very interactive. So I want to leave you off with this video. I'll post both of them on Schoology so you have a chance to check them out a little bit more in depth. I want to thank you all. This is my last lecture, so I am signing off, and I'm going to do a mic drop because